your director, Linda Trompeter, uh, coming to you live from where you are. And actually, this is the first time I've been the presenter for a webinar. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to save questions kind of for the end. However, as questions come up, you off here in the room, write them down. As questions come up for you as I'm doing the presentation, put them in. And if there's some I can answer in the presentation, I will. Otherwise, we'll have questions for the end. So this presentation, this is on guidelines for inclusive language. Now, I want to say a few things. I don't know if the video is going to work. Otherwise, and it was funny, but we'll see. I've been doing diversity education for a long, long time. And one of the things that I've learned along the way is that sometimes the most harm is done, the worst impact is done out of good intentions. In fact, most of the time it is. I would say, I bet you 99.5% of the people I meet are good people who want to include others, who want to be inclusive. However, we don't really know how to be inclusive for cultures, most of us, other than our own. So this presentation is on language that's offensive, but not that's offensive that many people necessarily know about. We don't know the N-word is offensive, right? However, we may not know, as I'm going to talk to you about in a little bit later, that colored person is offensive. So I'm not going to bring the most offensive words that you'd ever want to hear because those you know. And I don't hear people saying them, people like you. And so what I'm trying to educate people about on issues of race, gender, social class, etc., and I'm going to do a little bit on each, is things you may not know. Now, I want to say that words shape culture. Words don't just come out of anywhere. They have power. They have both denotations and connotations. Over time, different words develop different connotations and hit people differently. So that, and I'll be talking a little bit later about, take a word like chick. Some women don't mind it. I hate it. It's a word that I would advise people to not use, and I'll tell you why later, as I said, when we do gender language. But that doesn't mean that there won't be some women who don't object to it. Everybody's different. Sometimes they don't know the history of the word. They don't know the derivation of the word. Sometimes I've really upset people about weddings. This isn't on language particularly, but weddings, because I've started to tell them where the white dress came about. What was the giving away of the bride? All of this stuff was extremely sexist, and today, if people knew, they may not do it because they don't realize some of the things it was meant to convey that today maybe people don't want to convey. Does that make sense? Okay, so if something for clarification, if you don't understand it, then please put that down. Well, try advancing to this next slide, but I'm not sure that the actual thing will go on, doesn't it? Okay, this was for anybody who's interested, I will definitely have it up on the archived version. This is a sarcastic YouTube video by someone who hates what I'm talking about today and calls it, guess what? Politically correct language. You've heard that, right? I myself, and you can advance to the next slide. Okay, PC. I don't like to call it politically correct. I like to call it professionally competent when you use the right language, or personally conscious. I hate political correctness. Now, why do I hate that? Because what I found with many of the people who say, oh, well, that's just silly, that's just politically, oh, yes, I have to be politically correct, is that they're using the idea of inclusive language like a euphemism. Euphemisms are things that many times you should avoid because they're meant to distract from the whole thing you're talking about. People don't die; they fall asleep, they meet their maker, they pass. Those are euphemisms we sometimes say for death. When we change language, the advocates of changes of language, we're doing it not because we're trying to avoid the issue, but because we've come to a new understanding of what it is. Does that make sense? So therefore, we'll see this with disabilities as I go along. I will mention one now. We've come to learn, for example, what the word handicap means. Those of us know that it was derived from cap in hand. Think about the image of cap in hand. What is that, for those of you in the room, what does that produce for you? Beggars. Now, there's no accident. Words are created by culture. When you think a certain thing, you create a word that defines it the way you understand it. Well, at that time, when handicap became something that was used to define people with disabilities, people thought that people who had a disability could do nothing. Were helpless, they needed a handout, and we know that's not true, right? So those of us who know what the word means, and those people who have a disability, not everybody, remember, because they may not know the derivation of the word, but many people who have a disability would be totally insulted if you use the word handicap. They'd say, I'm not handicapped. Look what I can do. Does that make sense? Now, if we change the word from handicap, are we being political? In other words, are we just doing it for political reasons? Or are we being professionally competent or personally conscious? I want people to understand that this is not an attempt to soften, like euphemism is, reality. This is an attempt to correct a reality that we mistook for something else. That was a mistake. So what I'm going to do today is give you a question? No, okay. What I'm going to do today is give you some, we can do the next slide, I believe. Well, first I'm going to define inclusive language for you. Next one. Here's how I'm using it. Inclusive language does not stereotype, demean, or patronize individuals. Okay? And this is the part that I think, this is why we need education about it. Avoids the use of words or phrases that create or maintain a disadvantage for the people being referenced. If I think of somebody as not able, that creates a disadvantage for them when that's not true. Okay? So you say, well, I know. We don't know how to be inclusive because how do you know the history of words and the things very often that people find offensive? And how do I know that? Because I hear a lot of people using the terminology I'm going to tell you to avoid. Good people. You know, people in all settings. Okay, next. Okay, today I want to talk about race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, social class, disability, and religion. This is something I could spend 4 hours on each one. So what I decided to do was to give you a little bit on each of these areas of language to avoid. Now, I have a handout on this, so I can give you, so you don't need to furiously write, I have a handout of guidelines for inclusive language, so it will give you much of the stuff. And those of you who are on the webinar, just email me at lita@nepdec.org, and I'll be able to give it to you. All right, let's start with some issues, some phrases with regard to race. Next slide. We'll see. Doesn't matter if we have to go back. Oh, yeah. Oh, you want to go back? Oh, yeah, you're going back. Okay. Well, I'll get into it. I think the first slide is colored person. I think that, I can't tell you how many times I have heard that term in this region. And I guess other regions, but I haven't, been around other regions for a long time. I'll give you an example, and I won't mention which school it was, but I was doing a workshop like this for teachers at one of the schools in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I was talking to the teachers about avoiding the word colored person, and I had with me a African American man, and when I and let me first tell you why. Why is that a word that's thought of as offensive? Well, since the 60s and our understanding, well, let me say this. History is the most reason. There's a couple of reasons. One is the association with colored water fountains. It's been a term referring to African Americans, but the historical association of colored person and how used and how labeled colored white was used is very, it really hurts when you hear that terminology. Now, terminology around race is very difficult to begin with. Nobody's white, in the sense of, however, we stipulate certain definitions. So the census or the government might say, and we use the preferred term, person of color. Now, technically, we're all people of color, but in the usage that we want people to use it or that we're doing now, and may change later, a person of color is generally someone who is Latino, African American, or African. They don't have to be from America, Asian, or Native. And those of European, Caucasian background are the ones considered to be white. Interestingly, if you're Arab American, you go in the white category, even if you're Egyptian. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And I do whole workshops on what does race really mean. Can people in the audience here see why that could be an offensive term? It's not being politically correct to say a person of color. You're trying to be inclusive. You're trying to avoid the language that may sting, because what's really important in diversity isn't the intention, it's the impact. I can't say that strongly enough. It's not the intention of your language, it's the impact of your language. Oh, that's a good question. How does colored person not confuse people when the title of the NAACP contains? And that's an interesting question, because certainly the NAACP is aware of its history, no question about it. And I can't speak for the NAACP in particular. Here's my guess. This may or may not be right. The NAACP is an historical organization, which basically was started by whites, has had such a history, and it has such a positive, they've done such wonderful things that they've kept that title because of its good association as an organization. They may visit them. I'm sure they've had that conversation. And as an organization, it's a little bit different than an individual. Here it goes. So anyway, let me go back to that classroom. So I was telling the teacher to over that. And the one teacher turned to my friend who's African American and said, let's say his name is Rich, and said, Rich, you don't mind being called a colored person, do you? And the hair on the back of his neck, I literally rose. He couldn't speak. You don't care about that, do you? And then all the other teachers, not all, but most of the teachers in the room agreed. Well, I'm dumbfounded. I didn't even know where to go from this. They were saying, this is politically correct, this is silly, you know I don't mean to insult you, but the impact is what counts. So, that's one example. Minority. Minority. It's not that word is a bad word. It is. Some of these actually contextually are okay. Some people may get a little bit testy because if you knew world statistics, you'd know that those people who are of my origin or look like me are the minorities of the world. 70% of the world's population are people of color. 55% are Asian. In the United States, we're not there yet, but we will be. You know that. Within 20 years, white, Caucasian, European background, non-Spanish, will be in the middle. So technically, the word is wrong from a global perspective to call somebody who is African or Latino minority. And again, the words have power. Words have tremendous power. Can do some more, sticks and stones will break my bones and words will never hurt me. Bull. Words can sting just as much as somebody smacking you in the face, if not more. They have incredible power, and you want to try to be sensitive and to understand why certain words have the power that they do to be offensive to some people or to many people. All right, so Oriental. Be careful with that because there are some, and I'm glossing over a lot, that think of Oriental as referring to a thing, Oriental food. And also the usage in the past also plays a role. It's also people in general don't like to be grouped together into one category. If you know, you should say Korean or Japanese or Chinese or whatever. It's like, so Asian is the preferred terminology, not Oriental, but Oriental food, but individuals who belong to groups that are under that category. And we'll talk about that with Latinos. There's some groups that belong to that category. They don't want to be a big blob. They want to have recognized the enormous differences that exist. In fact, I think there's more similarities for those of us in European culture like German, Irish, Italian than there are between the Asian and populations, for example. There are a lot of things we share in common. A language, for example. My goodness, the Asian languages, there's just so many of them. Hispanic, I just want to tell you that there are some people under that category who who would prefer to be called Latino. And again, in particular, people from Mexico. Because Spain is in that category, the word, Spain. What did the Spanish do to some of the people who are in this country? Inquisitions, chopping off hands. So for some people, they would prefer you use a different term. Now, if you say Hispanic, are they going to, that's not so bad as I think colored person or whatever. But what I'm trying to tell you is that wouldn't you prefer to know some of this so that you would avoid what may occur? And also, if you have people in your organization, they will not feel left out. They will not think, oh boy, they didn't even bother to learn the correct way I want to be called. I don't want to be called. My friend Arthur hates to be called Art. He'll say, "Don't call me Art. That's a subject. I mean, that's an object. I'm a person, right?" So very often, some people like their short, and some people don't. We make that assumption. American. What I want to bring up with regard to that is that you think, okay, well, why can't you call somebody an American? Does anybody know? Well, we are very, what would be the word for it? Ethnocentric here in the United States. America isn't just North America. And if a South American, for example, hears that, we use American to refer to the United States as if the rest of the Americas are not America, right? And so I always try to say, I'm not saying that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what to do if you make a slip. We're all going to make slips, because you need to have these things in order to learn those things. But I try to say United States or North America. We even have that issue in our own area with Hazleton. We call the region the Valley. Is Hazleton in the Valley? I've heard Hazletonians say, that's probably why we never feel like we're part of the county. Because they think of the valley as the county, the area, etc. It's very similar, I think, to... Now, would you know that? No, because you're not one of the targeted groups. The ones who are sensitive are the ones that, in general, where the language hasn't been created for them, it's been created for somebody else. So you're not necessarily going to know that unless you've lived through that language. Mulatto? Does anybody know where that term came from? What a mulatto is? It's from the Spanish word mulo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right for those of you who are Spanish speakers. Mule, a mule. Cross between a horse and a donkey. Now, think about that. You might have heard this word, mulatto. You might have been given as a word to refer to people who are biracial. And you think, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with it. I told you history makes words. Why do you think the word is there? Look at the connotation. Look at the denotation. Look at what people must have thought to ever use that word as a description for a person. So you can see that you can see that what I'm doing is talking about terminology that you may not know. I don't have to give you the terminology that you absolutely know or offensive, but there's probably more that you don't know than you do know. And non-white, non-anything makes the standard the thing and the non. So avoid the non-white thing. And if you can, people's ethnicity, race, etc., are very, very important to them. What happens to the us who are majority culture, let's say white, heterosexual, Christian, male, is that we don't think we have a culture. We're so familiar with what is given to us as the norm that we don't have the experience of being non-anything. We're always in the majority. And so it's hard to realize that we're being defined in juxtaposition to the norm, and norm in the negative sense of the word, not in the statistical sense of the word. Is this making sense? Is it helpful? Is there any questions? Okay. First up with the microphone. All right. Okay, next. Well, we've heard that a lot lately, haven't we? Illegal alien. And I'm constantly reading commentaries in the paper. Stop being politically correct. It's exactly what they are. They're illegal aliens. It's a legal term. And yes, it is a legal term. Lots of things are legal terms. Colored was a legal term. What do you think, anybody, why do you think And what you're doing is you're trying to refer to a group of people that are what? They're not citizens, right? They're not citizens. Why use the word alien? What is it? Alien has developed a connotation of somebody who's strange, and as an individual, strange and foreign. And if you hear that word, it connotes images to you that really you don't want to have. So it isn't saying something about the issue. I'm not going to politicize the issue of citizenry, documentation, non-documentation. That's irrelevant. But it doesn't matter what you think about the political issue. The terminology is offensive. I don't ever want a person to be referred to as an alien. And I hope the law changes it because it's offensive. Next. All right, these are just some phrases to avoid. You're not like the rest of them. People of color often hear that, right? You're not like the rest of them, right? What do you mean I'm not like the rest of them? Who is them? And if you're talking about somebody who's African American, I am. I'm proud. I don't want to be taken out of that category. Okay, next. Oh, please, people. We're looking for a qualified minority applicant. Do we ever say that for majority applicants? Think about it. It's so offensive. Of course you're looking for a qualified applicant, whether the minority or majority. You may be taking issues of race, sex, gender into account if you were trying to diversify, but you're never going to should never hire somebody who isn't qualified, and nobody wants you to. So to say that, I mean, is enough said? One way to tell whether you're you do something that really you ought not to do is try to always have symmetry, matching. If you think it's okay to say qualified majority candidate, then it's okay to say qualified minority candidate. But if you don't say qualified in the one, you shouldn't do in the other. And that's kind of a good rule to follow. Okay. I don't see you as black. People say that to my friends of color all the time, and I know that, and they know you don't mean to be offensive. They kind of have an idea what you're probably trying to say. You're probably trying to say, I don't see color. But who doesn't see color? It's false. Of course we see color, and not only that, why not see color? Your color of your hair, your color of your eyes, your color of anything, for many people, is a very significant part of them. They don't want you not to color. They want you not to make distinctions between and make one inferior to the other or one less beautiful than the other. So I often do this. People on the webinar might not be able to see it, but I'm going up to Rich right here and saying to Richard, gee, Richard, when I look at you, I don't see you as male. Gee, Richard, did you like that? It's just like that. Substitute another thing. I think he wouldn't want that. He's proud of his sex, probably. At least, maybe not. I don't want to make assumptions. Okay, so avoid that. Never say that. Okay. I have to move on here. Some of my best friends are. Some of us, and I used to be this way before I became very, very comfortable and educated about differences. I had to prove to people I'm not a bigot. I'm not. But I am. I call myself a racist in recovery, and I'm a classist in recovery. I'm in recovery because our ideas are shaped by our culture, and none of us is immune to what the culture put in our head. None of us. We are not born baby, but as soon as we're born, the culture starts telling us this is good, this is bad, and it's in your repertoire. So you don't need to say that. You'd be better off saying, "Gee, I don't really know a lot about your culture, and I don't want to offend you. Can you talk to me a little bit about how I could be inclusive with you and how my language could be inclusive instead of saying this?" Okay, next. He's very articulate. I can't tell you. Actually, the president of the organization, I don't know if Arthur's online or not, is Arthur Brick, who's the chief diversity officer for Geisinger Hospital. And Arthur and I do lots of stuff together, a lot of workshops. I can't tell you how many times people will come up to Arthur, I see it out of the corner of my eye, and tell him how articulate he is. He is articulate. They never say it to me. Never say it to me. They assume I'm going to be articulate. That's the difference. They assume I'm going to be articulate. So they're surprised. What he hears, and that's what's important, is he hears, not what you say. What he hears is, boy, am I surprised that you're a black man and you're articulate. And if you ask, I have been a philosophy professor. I've given thousands of workshops. No one has ever said to me, we're so articulate. It's expected. So, again, you can't think about right or wrong when you're thinking about this. Don't think about whether this is right or this is wrong. What you've got to think about is impact and trying to make people comfortable. And that means trying to make them feel like they're important. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that with holidays. Okay, next. I think that's common phraseology. I'm Jewish, so I've heard it a lot. The belief that Jews are all rich and they're all cheap. So this is one of the ones that I would think you really know is offensive, but I thought I'd put it up anyway. Okay. Why don't you learn to speak English? The assumption is they don't. They haven't tried to learn. Every immigrant group comes over here with their languages that are different. And I'm telling you, majority of people that I meet, I don't care whether they're coming from Russia or coming from Mexico or coming wherever, the Dominican Republic, they know that in any country to get a job, to be able to rise up, you need to learn the language of the land just for practicality. But it's hard. It's extremely hard. And learning the language of the land doesn't mean that you be forced to give up your own native language. Europe doesn't have a problem with that. I love hearing Italian and Russian and German, and you're sitting in a restaurant, one table speaking Italian, one table speaking Spanish. Why do we have such a problem? But for one vote, our language would have been German instead of English. So just be sensitive again. You people. Okay, that's all I need to say. Don't say you people okay, I hear that a lot. Let's do gender a little bit. Gender language. How are you, hun? Now, in terms of endearment, I grew up in a culture where, people showed, waitresses do this all the time, and they may do it with male too. But, I've heard HR people do this. I'm in places where the HR person has not learned not to call me hun. I find it very offensive. I'm not her honey or his honey or, in the context, I know, now remember, I know it's not meant to be offensive. I know the person, but it's a form of ignorance to not know that is now known to be offensive. It wasn't offensive then. It was offensive then, but people had different attitudes about men and women then, and so in their culture, it might not have been seen so much as slavery was always wrong. It didn't just become wrong when we got rid of it. It was always wrong, but many people know it. Okay. Everyone in Baltimore says hun. What a beeb, chick, fox, doll. Please. What all these things have in common is they're diminutive. Culturally, for a long, long time, women were thought to need protection. They're babies. A doll. A chick, what's a chick? What is a chick? It's a baby chicken. So I'm telling you the history, the reason that word came about in the first place. Now, we have chick flicks, I know, that I don't think people know. I don't like because I know what it means. I don't want to be called something that's diminutive. I don't want that association. And maybe you don't have that association, but maybe your daughter does when she hears it growing up, or your son does when he hears it growing up and he starts using the term, and it becomes part of. So don't do it. That's my advice. You guys. I wrote an article about this in the newspaper not too long ago. Type trumpeter, and maybe it'll come up. You might have to pay the archive. Words create images. Words create images. Now, again, not everybody's going to find this objectionable, but I got to tell you, time I was little, and by the way, I grew up in Kingston, left for 20-some years, but then moved back. Every time I heard you guys, I visualized a guy. In my mind's eye, I mean, I'd have to make the switch. I'd say, oh, you guys, visual guy. But no, they're including me too in that for some reason. I don't understand why they are. Man the desk. All of these terms that now why did they exist and why don't they now? Boy, we've become a lot more sophisticated about discrimination and bigotry in all of these areas. We were awful. We still have a long way to go, but we were horrible. Sexist before sexual harassment. What woman before a certain age hasn't been I was sexually harassed my entire life 100 times. In terms of not in terms of quid pro quo, but in terms of posters, catcalls, jokes. We're a lot more sophisticated now, and the language has to start reflecting the level of sophistication. Okay. Use of titles, Mr. Jones and Mrs. Smith. I'm just going to be now. With that, I think many people might not know this, but for a long, long time there were 3 words: Miss, Mrs., and Mr. Our culture was a culture that wanted to know if a woman was married, but it didn't matter if a woman was married. And I can get into the history of the reason, but that's why. So that's why Gloria Steinem, when Ms. Magazine came out, wanted the symmetry. She said, look, make it equal, balanced, fair. Let's either have 2 terms for a man, and one that doesn't make married and one unmarried, or 1 term for both of them, and you don't know through that whether they're married or unmarried. And so she came out with MS. But people don't know why that is. So I still see people using MS for an unmarried woman, like the Miss was, and Mrs. for the married woman. So I really think people should use the Ms. unless you have an individual. You got to do what the individual wants. So if they say to you, I want to be called Mrs. Jack Jones, then you have to respect that. But in general, that's why it was created. It's another, but it tells you a little about our language and how important it was. So don't, I'd say if you're going to use Mr. Jones, and if you're going to use titles for everybody. I very often am with men who do not have a doctorate, and the students think they're Dr. So-and-so, and I'm Linda. Or use the titles for everyone, or no titles. It's exclusive. It's not fair. It feels wrong. Okay. Aggressive woman, your adjectives. Boy, have I been called an aggressive woman. Oh, my God. Can you see it already? I mean, I've never been called an assertive woman. I've been called an aggressive woman, but I don't see myself as aggressive. It's not my picture. But I certainly am probably not the type of woman that many men or women, I've been called an aggressive woman by women, think of as the behavior I should be exhibiting. So, assertive has a positive connotation. Aggressive does not. I like to think of the BITCH being in total control of herself. Okay. Sexual orientation, a couple of examples here that I wanted to mention. That's so gay. Horrible. They do in the schools all the time. Real put down to people who are gay, homosexual, GLBT. Enough said. What's your sexual preference? I do whole workshops on sexual orientation. How many in this room have a sexual orientation? The hands didn't come up for people on the webinar. Maybe some did, because we're used to think sexual orientation is only heterosexual. You know, a sexual orientation has to do with who you're attracted to, okay? Preference has to do with choice. It connotes choice. So I often say to people, okay, try to remember the moment you knew what you were. All right, I don't know, were you 11, were you 12, were you 10? I don't know what age we know that. We just know it. And did your thought process something like this? Gee, I think I could like women, I could like men, or I could like both. I think I'll choose liking men. It doesn't happen that way, does it? What happens is you just know. It's like, oh, whether you like certain foods. You didn't choose it. So it's offensive to ask somebody what their sexual preference is. We all have a sexual orientation. If you're doing something on sexual orientation, you talk about all the spectrums of sexual orientation. Are you married? This is not necessarily a language, but it really makes people uncomfortable who are GLBT because they can't get married except for certain states, and some of them are afraid to let you know that they're gay. So they'll lie, or maybe they'll say no, but they've been with somebody for 35 years, and they think you're going to think they don't have anybody. So be careful, just in general, saying that to somebody that you don't know, because you can put them in a very awkward situation. A gay man here told me he's laying on a examining room table in a doctor's office, and the doctor comes up and says, "Are you married?" And he says, "No." It's a gay man. "What's a nice-looking guy like you doing unmarried?" And it just goes on and on. So eventually he's going to have to, what is he going to say? So try not to put people in awkward situations. Social class. Just anything. She's just a housewife. He's just a plumber. What a derogatory thing. People might get paid more money, or some jobs might require different kinds of education. But that doesn't mean that they're less than in any way, shape, or form. And our language is rampant with making people feel less than. And we don't even know that we're doing it. I hate it when I go to a party and a woman will say, "I'm just a housewife." When I ask her, I don't ask people what's their employment. I ask them how they spend their time. Because then they can say, "Oh, I'm an accountant," or they can say, "I take care of my children," or they can say, "You're not making," because they feel uncomfortable. They will say that because we as a society have made them feel that. Okay. I'm sure you probably use this. Most organizations do, don't they? Now, come on. If I'm non-essential, why should I come to work? That's a real, but do we have to use that terminology? I mean, really, that is a real put down. We're all essential, aren't we? So why, again, the connotation of the word is offensive. It's offensive. So get rid of it. Be sensitive. Professional staff or non-professional staff. Same idea. I go to a school district. I'm doing a job with maintenance workers, and they're all men in this area. They were all men. They were all related, but it was interesting. So the one gentleman stands up, and we're talking about what offends people in the room, and he says, "The teacher's called professional, and I'm not. I do my job in a professional manner." He said, why are we distinguished that way? Why can't you do teaching staff and non-teaching staff? Because the connotation of professional implies you're better than. And that's how he hears it. And when he said that, I thought, you're right. I understand that. So we learn these kinds of things we're used to using that really are offensive. Lower class. Again, we've grown up with upper class, lower class. What does lower connote? Better, or is it better to be lower or higher? Higher. So we don't need to use those terms. We can use other terms to describe the same thing. I think I'm the next one. Economically or socially deprived. Imagery. I call people, how about if you use this word, economically exploited instead of economically deprived. Now, again, it's political, but it conveys a very different image, doesn't it? You're poor, but through no fault of your own. You live in a society that's exploiting you and that isn't just. So don't use words like deprived. Disability. What am I doing here with time? I'll give you a couple with disability. That's retarded. I think that stands on its own. Handicap, I talked to you about. Next one. Confined to a wheelchair. Wheelchair bound. I'm not confined to my glasses. I use a wheelchair. A friend of mine has polio. Thinks of a wheelchair as a freedom device, not a confining device. What we're doing is we're applying our own beliefs onto the situation. People aren't confined to anything unless they feel it that way or think of it that way. So be careful with that terminology. Victim of polio. Victim of deafness. Well, a lot of deaf people don't feel like victims at all. That's, again, you shouldn't categorize the feeling that a person has about whatever it is. Suffers, same idea. Suffers from MS. Has MS. Well, that one should stand on itself. Invalid. Invalid? Invalid. Do you want to be invalid? Again, our thoughts and views about people with disabilities were just loaded with this. Religion. This is stuff. I was on a couple of TV programs where this is the time of year where it's interesting to talk about some of the terminology with regard to religion. And there's going to be a religion webinar, but it's really going to be on businesses and how to accommodate. I told you that I was Jewish. Well, for 20 years, I've been at Misericordia Catholic College. And for many years, I think I was the only Jew there. And first, here are the things that I was sensitive to. And again, it's not about right or wrong. And they're all tied to very similar things. What does BC and AD mean? Before Christ and anti-dominant. In the year of our Lord. I don't believe in Christ. Now listen to this for a minute. I do believe in Jesus. Christ is not a last name. I know a lot of Christians don't realize that. Jesus of Nazareth. Christ means the anointed one, the Messiah, right? Muslims, Jews, Hindus do not believe Jesus was the Christ. So to use dates that's a theological pronouncement. Think about this for it. It's not objective. When you say Christ, you're making a theological pronouncement of something you believe. You believe that if you're Christian. You believe Jesus was the Christ. But we're talking about secular society, not religious, supposedly. So really, they've changed it to before the Common Era, BCE, and after the Common Era, ACE. Not politically correct. It's more inclusive. And it's not theological, which we shouldn't be. Now, the next one is the same thing. Now, it's not. It's okay to say, when newscasters say Jesus Christ, I think to myself, my God, Here is. Give me a newscaster's name. What's her name? Diane Sawyer. She's saying Jesus Christ on television. Jesus is the Messiah. She doesn't realize she is. She would never say Jesus is the Messiah, but you're doing that when you say that. You have to be kind of careful, again, for people's sensitivities. Merry Christmas. This is what I was on the thing about. I think the religion is the last group of things. This is what I was on about. And and actually, I belong to Temple Israel, and the rabbi of Temple Israel doesn't mind you saying Merry Christmas to him 1,000 times. But I do, especially when I'm at Mr. Cordy for 20 years and 5 people, when the Jewish major holidays come around, which are Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, nobody wishes me a good holiday. So here I am, okay, do they value me? Do they care about me? My most significant holiday, nobody even knows when it is. And yet at Christmas time, they're wishing me Merry Christmas 1,000 times. And I don't care about Christmas. Think about it. Does that make sense? So what do? Well, if I know who are Christian, I will absolutely wish them a Merry Christmas. Should and will. Absolutely. But if I don't know, I don't do that. I'll say Happy Holiday. It's nothing. You should say Merry Christmas. I'm not telling you to get rid of Merry Christmas. Say Merry Christmas to all your friends and your neighbors and your colleagues who you know are Christian. That's absolutely appropriate. But if it's somebody that you don't know, and even then, I know it gets a little dicey, but some people aren't celebrating any holidays at this time. Ramadan's over for Muslims. And the same thing happens for Muslims. You tell a Muslim during Ramadan, have a blessed Muslim Ramadan, and you will be a person who stands out as one of the friendly people for the rest of their time, because nobody does that. Imagine if no one wished you on your birthday, happy birthday. Nobody really. Now, what do you think? You don't think they're doing it on purpose? I know Mr. Cordy isn't doing that on purpose. They are not taking. You know how you take the time sometime to find out when people's birthdays are, so that you can wish them a happy birthday? I feel the same way. Why didn't you take the time? It's easy. Get yourself a multicultural calendar, and it'll tell you when every holiday is, so that you can do that for people who know are that particular faith. What church do you go to? Jews, Muslims, they don't go to a church. It's a synagogue, a mosque. A church is a very Christian term. Just be aware of that. And oppressed by the hijab. Most of the women I know, let's say, who reside here, who are in the mosque, or many women I did workshops in Bethlehem, they don't feel oppressed by it at all. They feel oppressed when they don't wear it, because they don't want to be seen as sexual beings to people who are not their significant, their husband. And they don't want to be sexualized. That's what they'll tell me. And that's part of the reason they wear it, is that it really avoids some of those things. But also, it's modesty, and men are also supposed to dress modestly. What do you expect? It's just an atheist. Atheism very often is thought to be an atheist. If you're an atheist, you're immoral. Well, atheism just means you don't believe in a God. It doesn't mean you're immoral. So usually it's in the sense that, well, if they're an atheist, they don't know what's right. But right and wrong don't have anything to do necessarily with religion. Some of us learn right and wrong through our religions, but I met some of the best, most ethical people. I think that may be the last one on that. So I'm going to, let's see. Okay, yeah. Let me pause. In fact, I might end it, but I had other things here about speaking up, but we're kind of getting late on them, and I want to save room for some questions and comments and reactions. What is, for example, what most surprised you of the phrases? I mean, like American. Thought about it. Are you married? Hadn't thought about it. U.S. I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm a U.S. citizen. I belong to the United States. Only because again, for most of us, we're all North American that you're talking to. But when South American friends, they say, why are you taking all of the Americas as yours? And the difference is that when we say America, we're not referring to all of the Americas. We're only referring to North America. If we were referring to all of the Americas, then that's the appropriate term. Why is it okay to say African American? Everything in terms of language really can't be isolated without history, I think, most things. And I don't feel the need to say Russian American or Dutch American because I've never felt like my culture means nothing to my society. When I went to school, I read about Europe. I did European history, and I was represented in there. Van Gogh. There were artists, authors, and so on and so forth. Groups that have been, and especially African Americans. No one has had the history here in this country other than Native Americans that they have had. Every immigrant population has been discriminated against. Catholics have been discriminated against. No one has had that experience where families were separated. And also, the other thing that really hit me one time is with the African American population. I often do a names exercise as a groundbreaker, and I'll ask people what's the derivation of the first or the last name or something to tell us something about their culture. But African Americans can't do that. Almost all of their last names are what? Slave owners. And, if you don't think about it, oh my gosh, I can't tell you. My name is Johnson. That didn't go back to my ancestry in Africa. That actually probably went back to a slave owner. So, they're the group that really has no name, that they can really find out. So as a result, many want you to know they're an African American. They're an American, but I want you to know my roots. I want you to, it's important to me. It's doubly important to me because it's been made important to me. It's, nobody ever asked me, what are you? So does that make any? That's the reason. It's not matching because many of us don't say that. People like to be known as Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, because that culture for them coming over now, and it would have been for our ancestors too. What happened to our ancestors when they went through Ellis Island is that people just automatically changed the name and told them to give up everything. If you want to be an American, North American, but they said American, this is what you do. You got to look like us, act like us, talk like us, and the whole thing. Times changed. People aren't willing to give that up. And I don't think our ancestors would have been willing to give that up either if it was modern times. You want to keep that stuff that's part of who you are. So I think that... Are there any other questions? Comments. Not just questions, comments. What'd you learn? Does anybody have any questions on the... Yeah. Well, let's just wait 1 second. Should I... I think that if there's no question, I'm going to close the webinar. Thank you, people, for attending. If for those of you who have other employees who would be interested in this, you think, it will be archived by next week. Thanks again.